Hello everyone. I am incredibly delighted to be in conversation with Charlotte on Stone Yard Devotional. But before we start off, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about her, part of what was covered in this bio, but part of which is testament to her incredible practice, but also the work that she produces. So, Charlotte Wood is an Australian novelist born in New South Wales, has a PhD from the University of New South Wales, is the author of 7 novels, a collection of reflections on cooking, and another anthology on siblings. She's won every award you can imagine, and last year she was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, which means that she's been jet-setting around the world talking about Stone Yard Devotional. But the award we really must give Charlotte this time over is for coming to India for just 5 days for the Jaipur Literature Festival, all the way from Australia, and doing something that I do not think I would do in many, many lifetimes. So thank you so much for being here, Charlotte. The more fun part of her introduction, though, is that she likes summer blooming jasmine. I like night flowering jasmine. Would have ideally liked to be an heiress or a gardener, or both. You know, you can usually only be a gardener when you are an heiress. And loves to fold the sort of pages of her books instead of putting bookmarks. So, once again, a loud round of applause for Charlotte Wood.
Thank you. Thank you.
Charlotte, we're here to talk about Stone Yard Devotional. You've done many, many of these talks already, so unfortunately, I am going to ask you to sort of give us a glimpse into the book. But before we start that, I want to set the tone for you a little, right? Stone Yard Devotional is the story of a middle-aged woman who ends up disconnecting from her life and going off to a monastery to find something or actually nothing. Very little happens throughout the course of the book, and we're going to talk a little bit about why that's important. But what struck me most is that this is one of the few books that you have to commit to reading. So it's one of the few books that I could not read on a plane. I could not read in between doing things. I had to disconnect myself. I had to switch off the internet, say that I'm not going to use my phone for the day, and commit to reading a book that forces you to really engage with it and be drawn into its world. What happens in this world, Charlotte?
Thank you, Anish. It's so wonderful to be here. Thank you all for coming. It's interesting you said that about having to sort of quieten down yourself to read this book. Quite a lot of people have said that to me, that they picked it up thinking, I'll just have a quick look at the beginning, and then thought, it's not going to work like that. I have to sink into a certain quietude in order to pay attention to it, I suppose. The woman in my book, she's an unnamed narrator. She sort of almost stumbles into this monastery of a cloistered order of Catholic nuns near to the town in which she grew up. My narrator is an atheist, and she never quite manages to believe in God, even though she ends up staying in this place for a number of years. At the end, we presume she stays on, but she's always kind of surprised that she's still there. When she first arrives there, there's been an unspecified crisis in her in her personal life and her working life, her working life is in environmental activism and conservation, and she's sort of hit a wall of despair in realising that all her life's work, she feels, has failed, and she just sort of can't go on. But she doesn't morally approve of that despair herself, and she doesn't want to spread it to anybody else, but she just sort of can't even, you know. And she ends up in this place, and she finds some sort of comfort in the rhythms, the order, even though she doesn't really get why they're there. She doesn't know why she's there, but she finds a certain solace, sort of contingently, in the labour, the sort of bodily labour of, you know, growing vegetables, collecting the eggs, going in and out of the church 7 times a day, even though she sort of thinks this is kind of mumbo-jumbo, I don't get it, but there's a kind of beauty in the rhythm of that life that she really comes to appreciate.
And she says at one point, I don't know how they get anything done if they're going to church 7 times a day, and then realizes that is what they are doing.
That's right.
And going to church is what you're supposed to do as a man.
She says, how do they get any work done? And then she sort of penny drops. She goes, oh, that's the work for them. But so she finds this sort of orderly life quite consoling, and then into that order come 3 sort of interruptions, visitations. You know, she finds that she can leave the world, but the world won't really leave her.
Now, the first thing that you notice in this book, right, is this impulse. And I think it's an impulse that many of us can relate to currently. I think the past few months have demonstrated more than any in the last few years that despair seems to be the flavor of the season. I think in the face of climate catastrophe, and you've spoken very eloquently on how ignoring the climate catastrophe is something you're very worried about, in the face of a growing tide of authoritarianism, in the face of so many obstacles, which make many, including the protagonist, who's an environmental activist who's made her job her life, right? This is not something that you check in at and then check out of, but it's something that you truly see as a calling. And for many of us, I think we've reached that moment of acknowledging that perhaps this is all in vain. And she ends up in a monastery, right, in a nunnery. Where do you see that impulse coming from? Is that an impulse that you felt? Is that an impulse you've observed?
It's certainly an impulse I've felt. I mean, what we're all faced with every day in the news cycle and in our consideration of what are our responsibilities as societies, but also as individuals. You know, I was just in the amazing, amazing session on the ocean, James Bradley's book, The Deep, and a question came from the audience about this very thing. How do we live with our responsibilities, but our capacity to cope with what is being demanded of us? How do we deal with it psychically, you know? And I think a lot of us are feeling completely overwhelmed, more and more paralysed, and you know, and there are kind of regimes intent on causing that paralysis. So the appeal of stepping out and retreating, I completely understand it. You know, when I started writing the book, I was trying to understand why a contemporary woman would become a Catholic nun, because I find it a very interesting choice and a very confusing choice. And until I came on the idea of retreat, and then I thought, I totally get that. And I've had many people say to me, I want to go to this place. You know, I'm an atheist, but I want to go there because of the desire to just take a step out of the onslaught. And I think it's a very common impulse.
And how do you think you navigate that impulse? Very early on in the novel, you see this strange inhabiting of this new space, right? She notices single-use plastic containers being used for the food that she gets. She complains about the food and says that it's not terrible, but I don't know if I'd be able to eat this for the rest of my life. She's lying down. She's doing nothing. She's lying down looking at the ceiling for a very long time. And there's enormous amounts of detail that goes into those days that pass by. And again, I think the reason this book is difficult to read if you're not paying attention is that you have to acknowledge that time is passing, but nothing is happening. How do you inhabit a character like that? And how do you figure out what it means to slowly give in? What happens? Is it submission? Is it...
Well, I think that's one of her questions is, what do you do in a place like this? I mean, initially she's just exhausted. And then when she sort of recovers from this a bit, she's trying to understand respectfully how to live this life. She tries to believe in God. She just can't quite make it over the lip of that belief. But she respects it in other people. But she also, for me, as a novelist, that kind of stasis is a problem, right? And I realised quite early on that I thought, I'm writing a still life. And I can't write a still life because a novel has to have movement. It has to have momentum. It has to have change. And a still life is too sort of static. And actually, I turned to a painter I know for advice. a painter, an Australian painter called Jude Ray, who's a beautiful, very highly respected painter. And the works that I love most of hers are still life pictures. But they seem to have this sort of shimmering energy on her canvases. And I think writers would do well to turn to other art forms, more often than we tend to. But I basically rang her up and said, can you tell me how you get energy into a still life? And it was fascinating to talk to her because she said, I think what the first thing I do is try and break up the surface of the canvas. And I thought, and you can see in her pictures, there's a sort of, sometimes you can see the canvas between the brush strokes, other times there's paint sort of dripping down the side. So there's this sort of instability in the surface of her picture. And I sort of put that away in my head, and then later I thought, I can use that kind of structurally, actually. This is kind of writing nerdery I'm getting into here, but to break up break up the text on the page, basically. My narrator is kind of writing a diary. In the beginning, it's a very overt diary. She says day 1, day 2, and she's making these observations of these weirdos in this place. Later on, when she's living there, that sort of fades away into a kind of internal diary. But I think that sort of fragmentation of the text hopefully helps energise the text. But then, of course, it's so interesting to me. Some people say that nothing happens in this book. Other people say, this is such a page-turner, I couldn't put it down. And I think both of those things, I hope that both of those things are kind of true. Yeah, because the interruptions that do come in and do kind of energise the physical space of the monastery, as well as interrupting her confusion, I suppose, about what she's doing in this place.
And I want to piece apart how those two things can happen simultaneously, right? That nothing happens, but this is still a page-turner. And I think one of the ways in which you piece that apart a little bit is by understanding that your form moves away from plot. And you've said that, novelists are being lazy and they're not doing service to their readers by forcing them to stick to a plot and giving them something exciting to run after. And instead, for this book, and I want to quote here, you said, I wanted nothing trivial, nothing insincere. And so in many ways, the book is a celebration of writing because every sentence is exquisitely crafted. And in that, it becomes a page-turner. What does that process look like?
What does it look like? I don't know, but I think part of what I hope makes this a page-turner is there is a kind of freight of meaning that is beneath the surface of the story. And a lot of that freight, that sort of depth, comes from my narrator's thinking about her childhood, her relationship with her mother, the town that she lived in, the kind of casual cruelty of country towns in Australia in 1970s and 80s, which is when I lived in a country town, which is where the book is set. So there's a huge autobiographical element to the book. I'm not a nun, I haven't left my husband, but the kind
We're sitting right here.
the mother-daughter relationship and the kind of my narrator's regret about things that she could have done more kindly, more compassionately as she was growing up and into adulthood. I mean, one of the things that happens in a place of great stillness and silence is your internal life becomes very active. Your inner life is sort of, and your dream life and your imaginative life sort of flowers up in a way that isn't really possible when we live in a world of constant distraction, where our focus is outward. In this kind of life, the focus is inward, and it's not a comfortable experience. It's not, I think one of the things I was interested in doing was trying to bring a very contemporary look at this kind of life. I didn't do research. I went to one of these places once for a couple of days years ago, but I have been on a lot of artist retreats, and I've done a lot of time on my own for several weeks at a time, and I know that feeling of going inside the self, and it's often quite scary. It's not a lovely, floaty, peaceful, wonderful time. It's craving this peaceful, wonderful time and getting these hours of solitude that you're desperate to get, and then when you get them, you don't want them, It's confronting. Silence and stillness is very confronting to us in our contemporary world.
You've called a lot of your writing a process of subtraction, and for many of you who are writing or thinking of writing a novel, Charlotte has written an incredible series of newsletters called Subtraction that are available that really delve into this process of writing. And the one that struck me most was the last one you wrote, which was on subtract obedience. And there's a way in which you narrate how James Joyce works through his own work and how most people don't get through James Joyce. And you quoted, I think, 1/3 of people never finish James Joyce, and that's not a problem. And that you have to subtract obedience, and obedience to form, and obedience to a market, and obedience to a certain kind of mass readership. Who were you writing this book for?
Stone Yard Devotional. Mm-hmm. Look, as I was writing it, I didn't think of who I was writing it for, but recently a woman commented on my Instagram account a very, very moving post about what the book meant to her, and she had been through something terrible. I don't know what it was, she didn't say, but she said, after having this terrible catastrophe in my life, nearly everything I read just made me full of rage because it was so stupid and so trivial. And I know this sounds quite boastful, I don't mean it to, but she found something in my book, and after her saying that, I thought, I write for people who have been through stuff, who understand that there are things that happen to all of us in life that change who we are, that mean, one of the epigraphs of the book is from Nick Cave, the Australian singer, from a book that he wrote, and the quote is, "I felt chastened by the world." And he wrote that in the aftermath of COVID, but also in the aftermath of his son's death. And as I was writing this book, I felt chastened by the world. This book came out of my experience of COVID, my experience of getting cancer along with a couple of my sisters at the same time, Australia's experience of these sort of rolling catastrophes of bushfire, COVID, mouse plague, flood, these kind of biblical rolling phenomenon that are completely overwhelming, and yet we have to respond to them somehow. So, I'd never thought before, who do I write for? But now I think that's who I write for, people who have been through stuff and who want something with depth. Because as a reader, that's what I want. I want a book that's not necessarily full of sort of showbiz and, anxiety about keeping readers. The books that I love are those books that are going on with or without you as a reader, that kind of authority and confidence. I love reading books like that, and I want to try and write books like that. Thank you.
I have two directions I can take this in, so I'm now very, very concerned. But I'm going to take it down one direction before we get to the biblical proportions you spoke of, because I think you also are very keenly involved in the work of literature. But before that, you started off the last of the last three novels that you wrote about 10 young women, right? The Natural Way of Things was about 10 young women. You've described it as rage that was against the patriarchy, and you've still had lots of people coming up to you with the book, including right now, where we had someone coming up with The Natural Way of Things. Then you went on to three women who were much older for the weekend, right? And this was about dealing with aging. And now you've reached this sort of middle-aged narrator, and you've come down to the single one, and you're sort of exploring what that means. Has there been a difference in the way you inhabit that process as you're writing about people across these different age groups?
I think one of the things that many writers, I don't know if you have this, a new book is always a reaction for me against the previous book. You know that, and sometimes it's in the beginning quite a mechanical reaction. So the natural way of things was about 10 young women imprisoned in the middle of nowhere in Australia for being, wayward. There'd been sexual scandals with powerful men, and they'd been picked up and dumped in this place. So that was about young women in particular, and the sort of imagined place in the middle of Australia. For the next book, I went for old women on the beach, which is sort of very mechanistic in the beginning, but I think it's almost like I need to just, remove that book from myself to go into a new space. With this one, it's written in a very different way from my others, partly because I'd begun it just as the pandemic befell all of us, and in the beginning I was writing something sort of more light-hearted, and it became suddenly much more serious because that was my experience of our lives at that time. And also the experience of COVID for me meant having the rug of my certainties completely ripped out, and I think that happened to all of us as in my culture particularly, maybe the hubris of humans who think we can control everything, we think we know everything, we don't listen to the people who actually do know, who are the scientists who've been telling this has been coming for decades, the same as we ignore them about climate change. So there's a kind of arrogance and hubris that then we all were faced with the consequences of that hubris. Then, as I said, in Australia, the climate disasters, and they keep coming. We've got fires at the moment. We have floods and fires sometimes at the same time. And I've forgotten the beginning of the question, Anish. I'm sorry.
No, about the three age groups. But no, you answered that.
But also, it wasn't so much about the age groups, but it's about women. I've realised sort of unconsciously, I've clearly become kind of preoccupied with groups of women trapped together who don't want to be there together and who really get on each other's nerves. And they might be cherished old friends getting on each other's nerves. They might be these young women captured together who you would think would be united against the oppressor, but of course they're not, because we're human beings and we don't. And then this community where these women have chosen this life, but they haven't chosen each other, and they have to get along. And I think one of, I guess an underlying preoccupation I have is, how do we get along? Yeah. How do we live with each other when we don't choose to live with each other? And yet we must. And part of our, one of the great sort of catastrophes that is happening, I think, is, this polarisation where if you don't get along, you have to absolutely hate each other. That sort of... So, I mean, these are microcosms. The worlds that I'm looking at are just little tiny, tiny microcosms. And hopefully not too... Well, I didn't want any kind of messaging in this book at all. But, it's exploring preoccupations rather than intending to tell people anything.
Because you're not being pedantic, you're not being didactic, you're not telling people what to do, yet you're learning so much through these women in these three books, but particularly in Stone Yard Devotional, right? I think when you see something of biblical proportions, when you see something like the pandemic, or you see something like this mouse plague, which is... which you must read to really experience. Because when you're reading it in this moment of solitude, it really takes on an almost biblical stature.
And it was happening in Australia when I was writing. So it was, and these plagues have happened in Australia from time to time. This one was pretty bad during the pandemic. So it didn't happen in the city where I live, but it was happening in the west of our state. But, these sorts of plagues happen when nature is out of balance. It was fascinating going to the UK to talk about this book. In the UK, they were horrified by the mice, just completely could not deal with it at all. And at one point I said, you realise these are your mice? Yeah. You brought these mice to Australia. They're not our mice. I'm of British descent, so they are my mice, sadly. But it was so fascinating to me that they had no conception that colonisation does so much damage that isn't just about oppressing people, but about these invasive species destroying the country, the land.
And the other two interventions also teach you a lot. One is the return of the bones of a sister who's been murdered. And the third is the arrival of another nun who you only mention by her full name. Helen Parry is always Helen Parry. Mm. And you have a way of drawing out these characters who are presenting very different ways of addressing these challenges, right? Mm. You've got your protagonist, your unnamed narrator, who said, I'm in despair, I'm going to check out of the world, as it were. You have Helen Parry, who is taking it on as her spiritual mission to fight against climate change and be the voice of conscience in the world. And amidst this, you have these nuns who are a little confused as to what should really be done because they've been doing the 7 prayers every day and going to church in and out, and now suddenly they have to also care about the world.
Yeah, and they've got these two weirdos who
with these two weirdos.
Helen Parry is very interesting to me. She's an invented character, but she is a radical activist Catholic nun. And there are these, when I was thinking about why would a contemporary woman become a nun, I could see that there are these, women I think of as kind of rogue operators. Some individual women religious who are at work in the world of fighting for justice, fighting poverty, fighting climate change denialism, and taking it up to, really speaking truth to power, going to jail. And Helen Parry is one of these people. So when she brings the bones of this other murdered nun back to be buried in the place, that's another storyline. There are things that happen in this book. But Helen Parry gets sort of stuck there because the pandemic is going on in the very background of this book, and there are travel restrictions. So she doesn't want to be there. They don't want her there because she's bringing with her all this sort of onslaught of the world's disasters that they have tried to leave behind. So there's this culture clash immediately between Helen Parry, who basically looks at them and says, what are you doing? The world needs action, and here you are doing nothing. And of course, they don't believe that, but it's a big culture clash that is difficult for all of them. And then Helen Parry is someone that my narrator knows from her youth. They had a troubled association, and there's a clash for them in that very personal way as well.
I want to end, and then we'll get a lot more questions because I know many people want to ask you several questions. The stakes of this book seem unclear at first, right? You don't know what the book is supposed to be achieving, and I don't think we should be asking what a book should be achieving to begin with. But as you go through, and particularly in this moment, you realize that there's 2 takeaways, at least for me, from here. One, being a strange return to religiosity, but not religiosity, but spirituality, right? There's some undercurrent of what do we do with this way of life, not necessarily its larger implications, but rather its minutiae, right? This is about those sort of acts of prayer. It is about the very actions that you do, not what you believe in beyond. So one, I'd like to piece that together. Is it spirituality? Is it religiosity? It seems something that's neither.
I don't think it's religiosity, but I do think it is a spiritual book. And that's a word that I find very difficult to use. Spiritual, it's a kind of degraded word these days, I think. But
partly because of us.
My narrator is she's wrestling with questions. What is the most ethical way for me to live? What are my responsibilities? What is forgiveness? What is atonement? And she's not coming up with, atonement is bing, bing, bing. There's no answer. They're very deep, very complicated and morally complicated questions. And she's doing morally demanding work. But it's sort of... I had this very lovely review the other day in the Washington Times by Ron Charles, who is a critic I love, and he said, she's not pursuing mindfulness, she's hounded by it. And I thought that was so interesting, that she's trying to escape, but she's being forced by this life to look at things that she hasn't looked at before.
And I think that's so important today, because I think in Australia, like in India, we're being faced by challenges that don't require necessarily scientific solutions. They don't necessarily require administrative solutions, but they require moral solutions, And
part of the moral solution is listen to scientists, I think, which we seem to be very reluctant to do. But yeah, there's the morality of acknowledging what we are doing is essential, and yet we don't seem to be able to make that leap.
Particularly in more difficult conversations, right? For instance, and this doesn't come up more directly in the book, but also what is happening in Australia today with anti-immigrant rhetoric, which you now see reflected across the world today, where in a strange way, you said this earlier, that forgiveness is a value that the West loves to harp about but never practices. And in a strange way, it is a Christian value as well that you turn to, right? And there's a way in which that religiosity, that spirituality, those values might come through this religious setting but retain their relevance. What do you do with people who are facing climate crisis and coming to countries with more resources, who are escaping war, persecution, and we're turning away, including in this country, where immigrants and refugees who come from across the border in Bangladesh or the Rohingyas are being demonized? How do we create a moral reckoning? And in some ways, you provide a very disappointing answer, because the answer is that the difficult work is to do that moral reckoning yourself, and you don't come out with an easy answer.
When I started writing the book, I don't know if other writers in the room do this, but I often, sort of out of desperation, come across some sort of quotation or idea that becomes my sort of guiding light through the writing of the book. And with this one, it was a quote by W.B. Yeats, and it was in an essay that he wrote, and he said, "Only that which does not teach, which does not cry out, which does not condescend, which does not explain, is irresistible." And I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to write a book that doesn't teach, that doesn't cry out, that doesn't condescend, that does not explain. And that felt like quite a risk to me, because I have written, The Natural Way of Things is quite a didactic book, and it's not I'm proud of that book, but I don't want to write that way anymore. And I also don't want to read books that are kind of full of explanation and admonishment and lessons. I'm not interested in reading that, because I think it's just not interesting. And it's not reflective of our lives, which are much more complicated than that. It's not that, if I just get the answer and apply it, then everything's going to be fine, because there are 5,000 answers and, So I didn't want to be didactic, because I don't have anything to be didactic with, I think, in this book.
On that note, can we have another loud round of applause for
Thank you.
Charlotte, and a book that is truly unputdownable. And in an age where artificial intelligence is learning how to think, this is a book that teaches you how to feel. On that note, can we have someone getting mics around and anyone who has questions raising their hands? The gentleman at the back there with the cap.
Hi, thank you so much for such a... Oh, sure.
We can see you, it's good.
Yeah, thank you so much for such a wonderful conversation. It actually really encourages me to read the book. I was really struck by this sort of how do you get energy into a still life and sort of the comments and conversation that followed after that. Particularly, like, you spoke about structure and then you spoke about fragmentation. And so I'm curious, like, how do you work to build a structure of fragmentation, like, with intention? Because if you go just for fragmentation, it's easy to sort of, like,
Totally.
be in chaos, and so much of this book sounds like it's about stillness as well and confrontation. So I'm just curious, how do you work to build that structure?
Thank you very much for that question. It was kind of it was almost a literal jigsaw for me at times. One of the things that I did much more with this book was trust my unconscious instincts about where to place these fragments. I wrote it in fragments all over the place. You know, I wrote stuff near the end, early in my process, and then, you know, so I've never done this before. I've heard writers do this a lot, and I always thought, oh, that sounds stupid, I'm not doing that. And I did it, which was to cut it all up and put it on the floor. And so I guess there are two strands of the book. The one strand is the present, which is the life in the monastery and those sort of rhythms. And then there's another strand, which is the memories, the dreams, the sort of mini stories of things that happen in my narrator's childhood and young adulthood that she remembers, grief about her parents and so on. So it was almost that I had the kind of macro story, I suppose, of the monastery, her arrival, the mice plague, which propel things, you know, and then Helen Parry coming. That was that had a forward movement, a traditional, you know, linear narrative. And then I had all these little fragments to kind of interleave between these other scenes. And I did that purely through a very, very instinctive process. And I couldn't have told you why I put some things where they are, except later on I could see, there's sort of symbolic, there are symbolic connections between this present-day story about the mice and then some memory about my narrator pulling rubbish out of the ocean. And I think part of what I discovered in writing this book was that there is power. There's much more power than I realised in trusting, really, really trusting that sort of back brain. And it's hard to trust that because it could be just gobbledygook, you know. And it is often. So you have to navigate that, pull out the stuff that is just gibberish, but trust, you know, and it takes experience. For me, it's taken, you know, I've said often about this book, it's taken me 10 books to learn how to write one book. But I loved doing that, and it seemed to bring a power to the narrative that I didn't know how to kind of harness before. And now I'm trying to do it again, and I don't know how. But anyway, thank you for that question.
In the front here, if you can get a mic to the front.
Hello, and thank you very much for this. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
I'm from Melbourne, and I'm in 2 books, and we've discussed your book in both those book groups. Thank you very much. Because one of the things that we really enjoyed was the mystery of it, that you hadn't put everything there for us in black and white. I'm driven mad by that, of course, but I do appreciate it. But what I actually want to ask you is about place. Could that book have been written anywhere but on the edge of a farmland, on the edge of a desert?
Thank you for that question. Thank you for saying that about mystery, because in doing this trusting that I'm not going to explain things, I know that means quite a lot of readers are not going to like it. And there's a sort of, I don't know if you have this, Anish, but there's a sort of people-pleasing impulse that goes on when you're writing, thinking, well, I can't do that because people won't like it, and I can't do that because people won't understand. And with this book, I was like, nah, I am not doing it. And it took, I mean, it sounds silly, but it felt to me that it took a bit of courage to do that. It couldn't have been written about another landscape, I don't think. So the landscape in the book is a place called the Monero Plain, which is where I grew up and where the narrator grew up. It's a very, very bare landscape. It's called the treeless plain. Bits of it look like the moon. It is so sort of barren. It's also incredibly beautiful, but you have to be sort of in it to see the beauty of it. And when I knew I wanted to write about the place where I grew up, but it had to match something in the story. And when I'd finished the book, you know, sometimes you don't know you think something until you say it. And somebody asked me about why does she go there particularly and not some other place. And what came out of my mouth was that she goes there because she knows the landscape will understand her, because she is in this completely denuded, stripped to bedrock kind of psychic and spiritual state. So it's almost as if she could only go there in some, and it's instinctive. She doesn't think, oh, I've got these 7 places and which one will I choose? She says it's almost an animal instinct that took her there. And I think it's because of this, the word bedrock comes up quite a bit in the book. She has psychically been stripped to bedrock, and this landscape is bedrock. So thank you for that question.
I just want to add to that. I agree completely, because, this people-pleasing instinct, which is why I said subtract obedience even to your writer, is one that readers will also enjoy. As a reader, I felt glad because I was not being indulged.
Yes,
There's almost a Catholic denial here. There's a very strict voice in the book that tells you that this is not an Instagram reel that is going to be catered to your algorithm that's going to give you exactly what you want. It's not giving you what you want, but you will still go through it and you will still love it, which I think there's something powerful about not submitting to that instinct.
And I think it's hard, that I'm so glad you like those subtraction essays. I think as writers, more and more we are kind of have a subtle pressure on us to do what the market wants. And when you're writing literary fiction, the market is like 3 people. So
all of these people.
I know, I'm incredibly lucky, I know that. But so, you do have this sort of anxiety about giving people what they want, even though the whole reason you did it has nothing to do with that. So, but especially in the world of, social media and so on, and I've had people, I'm sure, I don't know if you have, on social media say, well, I didn't like this book because these women didn't basically please me, And it's hard to respond to that by saying, tough. But you have to. As an artist, that's your job. Yeah. But it's kind of, it takes a bit of guts. Especially when you're kind of nice, when you want to be nice to people, to say, no.
And I can attest, she's very nice from the little time that we spent together. We can have one last question before I'm going to be told we're completely out of time. The gentleman at the back there.
The High Commissioner of Australia.
Yeah. So I actually don't have a question, so maybe someone should, but I have 2 very quick comments I want to make. The first one is to say I am the High Commissioner of Australia, and we are so proud of Dr. Webb Charlotte, her book, her being here.
Thank you.
Her depth, her authenticity, and I do hope that Indians will read the book. It's a very Australian novel, but its themes are universal, and I'm sure they'll enjoy it. You mentioned, and you're right to mention, the voices in Australia and around the world which are counter to flows of people, but I just want to make a managing comment on that, because I happen to run in the Australian High Commission in New Delhi the biggest visa processing office that Australia has in the world. We issue 500,000 visas to Indians every year. 350,000 tourists, 100,000 skills, and 50,000 students. Our grant rate for students is higher than it's ever been, and we've just opened windows for working holidaymaker visas to Australia and for new skills categories. So those voices are there, but Australian government policy is something else.
Thank you, Philip. I think we're done.
On that note, thank you very, very much again, Charlotte, and thank you so
Thank you,
much to
Anish.
all of you for being such a lovely audience.
Thank you
Charlotte
very
will be
much.
signing books, so you can find her there.